Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today is the first day of school. Specifically, it's the first day of GridSchool for Bitwig 3.0. This is a new subset of my ongoing series about Bitwig things, and in this series I'm going to be specifically teaching you basics and useful design patterns for understanding and using the grid. This is a outline of the topics I'm planning to talk about so far. This will change over time. I'm sure I'll add more things. I might reorder some things, but for right now, this is what's coming. And, I'm going to walk you through all the basics about the UI, the modules, what certain terms and concepts mean, and then eventually I'll get into more use case oriented things like how do you route audio to plugins and back, or how do you make MSEG envelopes, or how do you do phase flipping and band splitting and stuff like that. So the goal of these videos is to be much shorter than my usual deep dives. Some of these subjects may be a little more complex, so they may still run 15, 20, 30 minutes, but for the most part, I'm going to try and keep most of these down to 5 or 10 minutes long and just give you little bits, one piece at a time. So today we're going to be talking about, of course, what is the grid school, which I just did. And now we're going to talk about the first thing that's grid specific, which is the swarm oscillator. Now, the reason I want to cover the swarm oscillator first, before I get into basics about the UI and the modules and so on, is mainly because I just spent 3 videos talking about voice handling, and specifically for voice stacking. You do that to create unison in a lot of Bitwig instruments and grid oscillators. But there is a special type of oscillator in the grid called the swarm oscillator. And this is an all-in-one supersaw or super sine. And it effectively does unison. It's the easy way to do unison. In my previous 2 videos, I kind of showed you a regular sawtooth operator and then how to do voice stacking to create a number of voices and then assign the voice stack spread to the detune and then over in a mixer to a stereo option to get effectively unison out of a regular plain sawtooth operator, right? But you don't have to do that, and in fact that can be wasteful. In some cases, it may be simpler and easier to just reach for the swarm oscillator, which is a unison oscillator all by itself, and it's really cool. It's a little harder to understand at a glance than the other oscillators. I mean, if you drag in a sawtooth oscillator and you change its shape, you can see what the waveform looks like. If you change its sync, you can see what it's doing. If you change its multipliers, you can't see what it's doing, but you just know from other synths that use ratio controls that it's making this like 1 octave deeper, 2 octaves deeper, or if you change this value, it's 1 octave higher, 2 octaves higher, and so on. And you can, set up ratios that give you some interesting, like the fifth of the key you're actually playing, and so on and so forth. But the swarm oscillator doesn't really tell you what it sounds like from the shape itself, because this shape is not actually telling you the shape of the waveform. The waveform you're playing is either a saw wave or a sine wave. This is telling you information about the unison spread and whether or not that spread is linear or logarithmic. Okay, so let's take a look real quick. Let's look at it in this current state. Now I can just tell at a glance that this is going to have a linear spread between the voices. I also know, and we'll explain to you in a second, show you how this is a 9-voice unison. There's 9 voices in it. And this is controlling the width of the spread of those 9 voices, very similar to how Serum works, where in Serum, when you twiddle this detune knob, this is the width of the spread, right? The full width is the difference between the voice on the far left and the voice on the far right, right? The further apart they are, the more detuned against each other those outer voices are. And then all the other voices in the middle are proportionally spread. So this is a very linear, straight, even spread, right? But if you remember from my earlier videos, Serum gives you the ability to create exponential or logarithmic spreads. And so what that looks like is more like this. See how those two voices closest to the center are proportionally much closer to the center, and the space between the voices gets spread out the farther away from center they get? So this is a logarithmic or exponential spread. And this is there's another mode they have called inverse exponential right here, which is still logarithmic or exponential, but now it's the opposite. You can see that the outer voices are much closer to each other, and then the distance gets progressively farther as they move towards center, okay? So I'm showing you this because this is what the skirt knob in Polygrid does. And it's trying to show you all this stuff at a glance with the shape that you see in the middle, okay? So spread, you can see the bottom, the distance at the bottom going farther and farther apart the further I spread this. And you can squeeze it all the way down so that it's just a straight vertical line with almost no spread at all, right? This is the center point up at the top. And at the bottom, they're showing you how far the voices spread away from center, okay? Furthest spread, almost no spread. Now there's always a little spread because it's unison, but this is just kind of a graphic depiction of that. Now, the straightness of these lines is affected by the skirt. See, we get these exponential or logarithmic looking shapes to the lines, and they kind of mirror on either side of center. So here's what's happening. This is a linear spread when it's straight up the middle. This is a logarithmic spread. You can see that the first couple voices are going to spread out really quickly from center, and then as you keep going to more and more voices, the difference from left to right is very small. So this is very similar to this shape is essentially what you see in Serum right here. That's the skirt knob turned all the way to the left is this kind of shape. And then the other type of exponential shape where instead most of the voices are concentrated towards center. That is, sorry, it's so awkward jumping between windows like this. That is this shape, because here you can see that most of the voices are going to be close to the center line, and it isn't until you get to the farthest voices, the widest voices in the spread, that they start moving out faster towards the edges, okay? So linear, inverse exponential, and regular exponential. That's what the skirt shape is. Now what it sounds like and looks like is pretty simple to see in the oscilloscope, just like I showed you in the previous two videos about voice stacking. So let's look at it with just a moderate amount of spread and a linear shape to it. So you can see that they start, let's see if I can get them starting in phase. Kind of close to the beginning. When they're stacked up vertically, that's kind of where all the voices are the closest together they're going to get in terms of their traveling across each other, and so they're summing up. Like right about now, they're starting to. Oh, darn it! Let's try. There we go. A shape like this, when they're like this, the voices are close in phase with each other. So they're almost stacking up to just one big saw wave, and they're starting to break apart and move out of phase here. And when they're more spread out like this, they're very far out of phase with each other. So there's 9 points. If you count up all these points, there's 9 of them in total. 1, this little one is 2, 3, 4, 5. This little one is 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then here we're back to 1 again. Okay, so there's 9 voices. and it's constantly free running. That's the other thing to note about Swarm. I showed you in a previous video that in a saw oscillator, sawtooth, if we turn this trigger button on and off, and don't worry, I'll be talking about what this is in a later episode. If we turn this trigger button on and off, it was causing the types of unison we built into the sawtooth oscillator. It caused the waveform to always start kind of fully in phase and then slowly spread apart like you see here. And that works for the sawtooth and all the other oscillators, but not for the Swarm oscillator, because this does affect the oscillator as a whole, and it is making the oscillator as a whole re-trigger from the beginning of its phase, its cycle each time. And again, I'm starting to use terms that we're going to talk about later, like what is phase? We'll get to that later. But even though this is actually doing something, what it's not doing is anything related to these 9 voices and how they're constantly moving relative to each other, the phasing that they're doing. The phasing just keeps cycling constantly inside of this oscillator, and this button has no effect. So watch as I click different notes, you're going to see the shape change with every note. Oh, let's make the spread a little bigger so it's more obvious. See how it's so radically different every time I tap a new note and I trigger the oscillator? Well, the oscillator's kind of always running. I'm really triggering the envelope. But the point is, we're catching it at a different phase with every note because it's cycling independently of how I'm playing my notes. And even if I turn on the trigger button for the oscillator, which should make the oscillator itself restart in phase every single time, because it's a Swarm oscillator, and it's really a group of 9 voices that are constantly in motion and never stop, we're still going to see that the phase never really syncs up with each note. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand is you can't make this, like we did in previous videos, go back and watch them, you can't make this always start with the biggest, cleanest, summed, loud, single saw wave that slowly spreads apart into unison after each attack. That's something you can get with the other oscillators, but not with the Swarm oscillator. So it's a very natural sounding super saw because of that, because it's always a little different on every attack. See how it actually sounds different with each note attack? The timbre changes with every attack. And that effect becomes more pronounced if I make it higher pitched, but anyway. Okay, so this is the spread, and the farther I push it up, the more detuned and sour sounding all those 9 voices become relative to each other. And it just turns into a big flabby mess over here, mainly because I'm at such a low pitch. Let's pitch it up to its normal. Okay, so you can really overdo it and make it as sour and messy and chaotic as you want. Usually the sweet spot is about this much spread in here. And then the skirt, again, is determining whether that spread is linear or exponential. And you can hear this and see this if you play with it at certain settings. So pay really, really close attention to the skirt as close to center as possible. So most of the voices are clustered around the center, and it's only like the outer 2 or 3 voices that are the full extent of the spread. I'm going to turn the spread up. Let's make it a little less sour. Okay, hear that slight difference in timbre? When more of the voices are pushed further away and very few voices are close to center, it sounds a little more sour and the timbre changes accordingly. It gets a little darker and messier. And when most of the voices are clustered towards center, it sounds more like a single note instead of a chorus of 9 different notes. Okay, so the moral of the story with the skirt is basically the more you pull it left, the more you pull everything in towards the center, the cleaner and more pure the note will sound. Also, if you're in stereo mode, it's going to be more mono-compatible, because that's the other big part about moving voices in towards the center or out towards the edges. So let's talk about stereo now. The way you get a stereo sound out of this, because right now you can see the meters, even though we're supposed to be seeing left and right channels independently, they're right on top of each other. So we have phasing, but the phasing is all happening in mono. It sounds wide because your brain thinks sounds like this are wide, but it's really just straight down the middle. And we can see this by looking at a spectral meter. Okay, where's my note? Where's my note? Where's my notes? Why did you stop playing notes? All right, let's turn off the audio engine and reinstantiate it. There we go. Okay, so you can see, even though we've got all this phasing and to your brain it sounds kind of wide, it's straight down the middle. Straight down the middle. There's nothing happening out on the sides yet. Now, as we take this detune value and we turn on the plus sign to make it now send out left and right channel at different offsets from each other, this value here is going to push the offset up for the right channel just a little bit. We're going to go to plus 0.01. Oh, plus 0.01, not minus. There we go. Come on. There we go. So watch this now. So now we have a stereo signal with stereo movement. This is what it looks like in this graph. This is the center, and what's happening out on these edges are the sides. So we can see that this is still kind of mostly mono-compatible because most of the energy stays in the center. And it's only when the left and right phase at this slow phase detune here, it's only when they get really far apart after a long time that we start seeing the energy on the sides becoming too much. And we watch the stereo correlation move up to 100% and then go over it, which means we have negative correlation and it's no longer mono-compatible. Like when your waveforms look like this, it's not very mono-compatible, right? Now, if I turn up the detune just a little bit between the left and the right, if I detune the right a little bit more, we're going to see the phasing problems much more explicitly. Okay, so you can see it's jumping all over between energy in the center versus energy on the sides. You can also see over here that it's going over 100% a lot of the time. See all this red? That means it's very not mono-compatible. See it staying in the sides for a long time with a hollowed out center? That means it's not very mono-compatible. But if I take this skirt and I move it all the way left to pull more of those voices into the center, we're going to see this improve a little bit. Just a little bit. Now, it's a fine line because it's going to depend on how much detune we have. Let's go for a smaller amount of detune. Let's put the skirt in the center again. So we're staying mostly mono-compatible with short notes like this because all the energy stays in the center. And the peak is never going above 70%. And the RMS is staying down around 33 to 40%, you know, between the mid and the sides. if we were to push the skirt up and push more of those voices away from the center, we're going to see these numbers starting to look a little worse, and we're going to see this graph looking a little more chaotic. See how I'm getting lines up to, peaks, short temporary peaks up here now? And I get more energy out in the sides. So the point is, if I drag it all the way into the center again, it's not going to do that. See how this peak is staying below 100% correlation? So that's the main takeaway I want you to understand about this skirt control, is it does two things. It kind of controls the timbre of the supersaw. It also controls the mono-compatibility. So when you take this supersaw and you try and make it stereo by detuning it just a teeny bit and turning this on, you can fine-tune its mono-compatibility in part just by using the skirt to pull more of the voices towards the center or push more of the voices out towards the edges. And that's what this is about. And honestly, I struggled with this for a long time. Like, what is this doing? I don't understand this wave shape. And it wasn't until I really dug into the voice handling in Unison that I started going, oh, that's what this graph is trying to show us. Okay, now as for the sine version, it's just a different behavior. When sines are in unison, they look and sound different than when saws are in unison. So let's just see what this sounds like. And let's pitch it up a bit. And this, I can also show you something interesting about the supersaw when we're doing this. Okay, so just a big sine fundamental, right? I've got a spread on it, but it doesn't seem to be doing much, and you don't see as much action here. Let's set this back to mono by setting this to 0 and turning off the plus and minus sign. So you don't see the waves moving across each other, you just see what looks like the amplitude bouncing up and down. And if we were to slow this down, or speed this up perhaps, let's see, let's change the scale to 36. See how it just looks like there's a bigger sine wave that's shaping the smaller sine waves, but the smaller sine waves never seem to change in distance or phase and turn into lots of little jaggy looking sine waves that spread out from each other like the supersaw did. And that's just because of how sine unison works. This is what sine unison looks like. And over here, you don't see any difference at all. It just looks like one big fundamental peak around C2 or C3 or whatever this frequency is. So what is it doing actually? All right, we can figure that out by going to a wider spread. And watch the waveform now. See all this jiggle? And see how the whole frequency spectrum that the sine wave was spread across is much wider now? Let's take spread all the way down. Take it up. And that bounciness in between the edges of the bigger sine wave, that's the phasing you're seeing here. That's the phasing of the 9 different voices. And if we were to, let's turn it up a little bit. Let's make it a little bit higher pitched. Okay. See all that bounciness in the middle of the wave? That's the 9 different voices zipping around back and forth at different speeds and phasing with each other, but they're phasing with each other in the context of the bigger single sine wave that's making this look fatter and skinnier all the time as the bigger sine wave moves through and shapes the individual sines. And we can see the skirt doing a really interesting thing here. Watch as I go with a spread where most of the voices are pulled into the center. See that little peak right there? And now if I push it out, you're going to see a hollow, a notch where that peak was. See that notch right there? And if we speed it up even more, we can hear it and see it even better. See that notch? And if we pull them into center, see the peak? But the width of that particular sine note is about, it doesn't change. Okay. So spread, again, if we bring it all the way into the center and we pull all the voices as close as possible to this least amount of spread, it looks very much like a regular simple sine wave. Let's take this down an octave because that's nasty. Okay. But then as we start spreading it, you're going to watch that thing get wider. And this is the main thing to see. See how the tip, the very center of the sine wave, keeps bouncing around ever so slightly to different notes or different, hertz values in the spectrum here. And so you hear the note as being unstable in pitch. It's wobbling around very unpredictably and kind of seemingly randomly in pitch. And also amplitude, because of the phasing. You can see the bigger sine wave superimposed on top of the smaller sine wave of the 9 individual voices, and then there's this sort of bigger single voice for the whole oscillator, kind of, sort of. It's just the way that the unison is phasing. And so you see this is a louder part of the signal, this is a quieter part of the signal, so it's making the pitch jump around and it's making the volume amplitude jump around. Okay, so that's what the sine unison looks and sounds like, and you can play with that. So there you go, swarm oscillator, one of the non-intuitive oscillators until somebody explains it to you, and then you go, oh, cool, it's a supersaw, I can do things with it. And I guess the final thing to note about this is that if you do a stereo detune, as I pointed out in my previous videos by making those 2 settings there, you effectively have 18 voices, because there's now a left signal with 9 voices in it and a right signal with 9 voices in it, and they're detuned from each other, so those 2 sets of 9 are interacting with each other and phasing across each other in the stereo field, and that's an 18 voice stereo unison. And the same thing is true, again, if we set this back to mono, but if we were to come over here and set up voice stacking for the grid, what did you do? Come here. If we set up voice stacks, okay, that would be 2 sets of 9 or 18 voices. This would be 5 sets of 9 or 45 voices. And you can see it's pretty efficient. Watch the CPU meter up here. Oops, damn, I'm so sorry about that. When you add voices, it gets louder. Look at that. The oscillator, the CPU meter is barely moving with effectively 45 different voices being stacked up. So that's pretty good for a supersaw. So thanks for hanging with me. Other GridSchool tutorials will be shorter. This was kind of a beefy one to talk about because I had to keep tying it back to my previous videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.